Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel After Dark. Tonight we're drifting off into the history of the causes of World War II, the Holocaust, Nazi Germany, the atomic bomb, the space race, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But before we dive in, be sure to check out the video description below for some resources that will help you relax and fall asleep naturally. Let's dive in. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the world just before everything changes. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of held breath, of a civilization standing at the edge of something it cannot yet name, but somehow already feels. To understand how the world arrived at the most destructive conflict in human history, we have to go back further than the gunshots and the marching boots. We have to go back to a continent that was already broken, already exhausted, already quietly furious, and understand why it was so ready to burn. The year is 1919. The First World War has just ended, and 17 million people are dead. The survivors walk out of the trenches into a world that smells of mud and ash and something else, something harder to name. Betrayal, perhaps. Or the particular grief of winning a war and finding that victory tastes like nothing at all. In Paris, the great powers of the world gather to decide what comes next. Britain, France, the United States, and Italy sit around the table. Germany is not invited. This is the first thing to understand about what follows. Germany did not negotiate the terms of its surrender. The terms were handed to it, and the document that emerged from those meetings, the Treaty of Versailles, would do something that very few pieces of paper in human history have managed to do. It would plant the seeds of another world war before the first one had even finished being mourned. The treaty forced Germany to accept complete and sole responsibility for starting the war. This was written directly into the document, in what became known as the War Guilt Clause. Article 231. Germany was made to confess, in ink and in public, to a guilt that much of the German population simply did not believe was theirs alone to carry. The war had been a tangled, catastrophic mess of alliances and miscalculations involving nearly every major European power, but Germany was made to sign its name beneath the words that said otherwise. That signature would fester, and the punishment that followed the guilt was staggering. Germany was stripped of roughly 13% of its territory and about 10% of its population. It lost the Rhineland as a buffer zone, lost the Saarland with its coal mines, lost colonies in Africa and the Pacific. Its military was reduced to a ghost of what it had been. 100,000 soldiers, no air force, a navy stripped of its great ships. And then came the reparations. Germany was ordered to pay the equivalent of what many historians calculate as roughly $33 billion in the currency of the time. A sum so enormous, it would not be fully paid off until the year 2010, to a nation that had been promised, by American President Woodrow Wilson himself, a peace based on fairness and self-determination. This felt like a knife in the back. And that phrase, the stab in the back, would echo through German politics for the next 2 decades, growing louder and more dangerous with every passing year. But the treaty alone does not explain what came next. Treaties are paper. What came next required something more. It required a country brought to its knees by forces it could not control, and a people desperate enough to listen to anyone who promised to lift them back up. The 1920s in Germany were a decade of wild swings. There were moments of genuine cultural brilliance. The Weimar Republic, Germany's first real democracy, produced extraordinary art, music, and philosophy. Berlin became one of the most vibrant cities in the world. But underneath the cabaret lights and the modernist paintings, there was a deep instability. The German economy was fragile, the government was fractured, and the old order, the Kaisers and the Prussian generals and the aristocrats, was gone, leaving a vacuum that no one quite knew how to fill. And then, in 1923, the floor fell out entirely. Germany, unable to keep up with reparations payments, defaulted. France and Belgium responded by occupying the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to take resources directly. Germany, in turn, responded by printing money, more and more and more money, until the currency became worthless. At the height of the hyperinflation crisis, a single loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. People carried money in wheelbarrows. Life savings became worthless overnight. The middle class, the doctors, the teachers, the shopkeepers, watched everything they had built dissolve into paper. Germany stabilized, briefly, in the mid-1920s. American loans helped. The economy recovered. People exhaled. But the memory of the wheelbarrows did not go away. And when the next crisis came, and it came from across the ocean, from Wall Street, in October of 1929, Germany had no cushion left to fall onto. The Great Depression hit Germany with a ferocity that is difficult to overstate. American banks, suddenly desperate for cash after the stock market collapse, called in the loans they had made to Germany. Credit dried up overnight. Businesses collapsed. By 1932, roughly 6 million Germans were unemployed, nearly a third of the entire workforce. People stood in bread lines. Children went hungry. Men who had once owned shops or run small factories found themselves with nothing. Into this despair walked a political movement that had been lurking at the fringes, growing, watching, waiting. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, and at its center, a man who had been born not in Germany, but in Austria, a failed art student, a drifter, a veteran of the First World War who had been left absolutely shattered by Germany's defeat and consumed by a need to explain it, to blame it, to find someone responsible for the humiliation he felt as personally as if it had been done to him alone. His name was Adolf Hitler, and in the rubble of the German economy, his voice carried further than it ever could have in a stable, prosperous nation. It is important, when we talk about Hitler's rise, not to reduce it to something simple. He was not some alien force that descended on an unwilling people. He was elected. In the July 1932 elections, the Nazi Party won 37.4% of the vote, the largest share of any single party in the Reichstag. He was appointed chancellor in January 1933 by President Paul von Hindenburg, who believed, as many conservative elites believed, that Hitler could be managed, that he was a useful firebrand who would energize the masses and then be controlled by wiser hands. This was one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in the history of the world. Within weeks of becoming chancellor, Hitler began dismantling the democracy that had brought him to power. The Reichstag fire in February 1933, a fire that destroyed the German parliament building, in which the Nazis blamed on a communist conspiracy, gave Hitler the pretext he needed. He convinced Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties and allowed the government to imprison political opponents without trial. Then came the Enabling Act of March 1933, which gave Hitler the power to pass laws without the Reichstag's approval. Just like that, the Weimar Republic was over. Not with a revolution, but with a vote. The Reichstag voted to give away its own power, with only the Social Democrats voting against. Germany was now a one-party state, and the quiet, terrible machinery of what would follow began to turn. What Hitler offered Germany was simple, and it was seductive precisely because of its simplicity. He offered an explanation for all the suffering, not the complicated, messy, economic explanation involving global finance and treaty terms and bad luck, but a clean, horrible story with a villain at its center. He offered a vision of Germany restored, Germany triumphant, Germany finally given its rightful place in the world. He offered purpose and belonging, and the intoxicating feeling of being part of something enormous and historic. And he offered hate as a kind of medicine, the idea that if the right people were removed, the right enemies defeated, everything broken could be made whole again. The world in 1933 watched Germany change, and mostly it looked away. There were other problems. The depression was everywhere. The memory of the last war was still raw. No one wanted another. And so the watching continued, and the machinery turned, and the silence before the storm stretched on a little longer, heavy with everything that was coming and not yet arrived. There is a particular cruelty in the way that oppression rarely arrives all at once. It does not knock down the door on the first night. It comes gradually, in steps, each one small enough to seem survivable, each one making the next one easier to accept, until one day you look back and can no longer see the place where normal ended and the unthinkable began. This is how it happened in Germany. In the first months after Hitler became chancellor, the changes came quickly, but not yet with their full horror. The political opposition was silenced first. Communist Party members were arrested in the thousands following the Reichstag fire. Trade unions, which had been a powerful force in German working life, were abolished in May of 1933. Their offices were raided, their leaders arrested, their funds seized. Political parties other than the Nazis were banned by July of that same year. Germany had gone from a functioning multi-party democracy to a single-party state in less than 6 months. But Hitler was not content with political control alone. He understood, with the instinct of a demagogue, that power is not truly secure until it lives inside people, until they have internalized it, until they believe in it, until they would defend it themselves without being asked. And so the machinery of propaganda was built with extraordinary care and speed. Joseph Goebbels was appointed Minister of Propaganda in March of 1933, and he approached the job with a kind of dark genius. He understood that you do not change what people think by arguing with them. You change what people think by controlling what they see, what they hear, and what they're allowed to say. By the end of 1933, the Nazi Party controlled or had shut down virtually every newspaper, radio station, and cultural institution in Germany. Books were burned in public squares. Some 25,000 books in a single night in May of 1933 in university towns across the country, as students and professors threw the works of Jewish authors, political dissidents, and anyone deemed incompatible with the new German spirit into the flames. The poet Heinrich Heine had written, more than a century earlier, that where books are burned, human beings will ultimately also be burned. He was right, and the people who lit those fires in 1933 could not yet see it, or would not. The Hitler Youth was formalized and expanded, pulling children into a world where loyalty to the Führer was woven into every activity, every song, every camping trip and athletics competition. Children learned, gently at first, and then not so gently, that the highest virtue was devotion to Germany and to Hitler, above family, above church, above individual conscience. A generation was being quietly remade, and all of this was accompanied by something else, something that had been present in Nazi ideology from the very beginning, and that was now, carefully and systematically, being written into law. Anti-Semitism was not invented by Adolf Hitler. It had roots going back centuries in Europe, in religious persecution, in economic scapegoating, in conspiracy theories so old they had calcified into something that felt, to those who believed them, like common sense. What Hitler did was take that ancient, simmering hatred and give it the machinery of a modern state. The Jews of Germany, who numbered around 500,000 people in 1933, less than 1% of the total population, had been a part of German life for centuries. They were doctors, lawyers, professors, shopkeepers, soldiers. Many had fought for Germany in the First World War. Many thought of themselves, first and foremost, as Germans. They were, by any measure, deeply woven into the fabric of the country. None of that would matter. In April of 1933, just months after Hitler took power, the Nazi government organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. Stormtroopers stood outside Jewish-owned shops with signs urging Germans not to enter. It was a test, a way of seeing how the public would respond, how much the machinery could be pushed. The response was mixed. Some Germans participated enthusiastically. Others quietly ignored the boycott and went on with their lives. Almost no one protested loudly. The machinery noted this and moved forward. The laws came next. In September of 1935, at a Nazi party rally in Nuremberg, Hitler announced 2 new laws that would strip German Jews of their citizenship and their most basic rights. The Nuremberg laws, as they came to be known, declared that only those of German or related blood could be citizens of the Reich. Jews were no longer citizens. They were subjects, and then, in practical terms, something less than that. The laws also prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, reducing human beings and their most intimate relationships to a matter of racial policy enforced by the state. These laws required definitions. The state had to decide who was Jewish, and so bureaucrats sat down and drew lines through family trees, counting grandparents, measuring bloodlines with a cold administrative precision that would have been almost absurd if it were not so lethal. A person with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was classified as Jewish. 2 grandparents put you into an intermediate category. The whole apparatus of exclusion was given a clinical tidiness that helped disguise the savagery underneath. Jews were progressively removed from public life. They were barred from practicing medicine, from working in the legal profession, from teaching in universities, from working in journalism. Jewish children were expelled from public schools. The definition of normal life was redrawn, and Jews were placed outside it, step by step, law by law, until the exclusion that had once seemed extreme began to seem, to those not experiencing it, simply like the way things were. And still, the world mostly watched. There was a moment, a rare, strange, almost dreamlike moment, in the summer of 1936, when Germany hosted the Olympic Games in Berlin. Hitler saw the Games as a showcase for the new Germany, for the power and beauty of the Aryan race, as the Nazis defined it. The stadium was magnificent. The pageantry was extraordinary. Leni Riefenstahl filmed it with a visual artistry that made propaganda feel like poetry. And for 2 weeks, the anti-Jewish signs were quietly taken down from shop windows and park benches, the uglier edges of the regime temporarily smoothed for foreign visitors and cameras. But something else happened at those games that Hitler had not planned for. A Black American athlete from Cleveland, Ohio, named Jesse Owens, won 4 gold medals. In the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the long jump, and the 4x100 relay. He was the most decorated athlete of the Games. The narrative of Aryan supremacy, which the entire spectacle had been designed to broadcast to the world, stumbled in the face of one man's extraordinary grace and speed. It did not stop anything. The machinery kept turning. But for a moment, in the long jump pit and on the track, something had been quietly, beautifully answered. The foreign visitors went home, the cameras packed up, and the signs went back up. By 1937 and 1938, the persecution was accelerating. Jewish-owned businesses were being forcibly sold to non-Jewish Germans at a fraction of their value in a process called Aryanization, the systematic transfer of Jewish economic life into German hands. Jews were being pushed out of the economy entirely, made dependent, made visible, made vulnerable. And then, in November of 1938, the violence that had been building beneath the surface erupted into something that could no longer be mistaken for anything other than what it was. On the night of November 9th, continuing into the 10th, 1938, organized violence broke out across Germany, Austria, and parts of Czechoslovakia. It had the appearance of a spontaneous popular uprising. Ordinary Germans, finally expressing their rage against the Jews. But it was neither spontaneous nor unorganized. It had been orchestrated by the Nazi leadership following the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Jewish man whose family had been among the Jews expelled from Germany. In a single night, somewhere between 7,500 and 10,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. Around 1,400 synagogues were burned. Ancient houses of worship, some of them centuries old, reduced to ash and broken glass in a matter of hours. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated. Approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, and at least 91 people were killed directly that night, though the true number was almost certainly higher. The streets the next morning were covered in broken glass from shattered shop windows. It glittered in the November light, and so the night was given a name that tried to make it sound almost beautiful: Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. But there was nothing beautiful about it. It was a declaration, in fire and blood and shattered glass, that the Jews of Germany had no protection, no recourse, and no future within the borders of the Reich. The world this time did react. There was international outrage. Editorials were written. Ambassadors were recalled. President Franklin Roosevelt said publicly that he could scarcely believe such things could occur in a 20th century civilization. But reaction and action are different things, and the doors of most nations, including the United States, remained largely closed to the Jews who were now desperately trying to leave. In July of 1938, just months before Kristallnacht, a conference had been held in the French resort town of Avion, convened by Roosevelt himself, to discuss the refugee crisis. 32 nations attended. Almost all of them expressed sympathy. Almost none of them agreed to take in significantly more refugees. Australia said it did not want to import a racial problem. Canada said its immigration quotas were full. The United States, despite having pushed for the conference, declined to raise its own immigration limits. The Jews of Germany and Austria listened to the radio reports from Avion and understood something that the conference delegates perhaps did not fully grasp: that sympathy without action is a door that looks open from the outside but does not move. And so the trap closed a little tighter, and the machinery, receiving no meaningful resistance from the world beyond Germany's borders, turned a little faster. We are still, it is important to remember, in the years before the war. The Holocaust, that word that would come to mean the systematic, industrial murder of 6 million Jewish people, had not yet fully taken its final form. What was happening in these years was the creation of the conditions that made it possible. The dehumanization, the legal exclusion, the economic destruction, the violence, all of it was building something. All of it was teaching a lesson, over and over, to perpetrators and bystanders and victims alike, that this could happen, that it was happening, and that no one was going to stop it. Outside Germany's borders, meanwhile, the world was moving toward a crisis of its own. Hitler had been watching the international response to everything he had done, and he had drawn conclusions. He had remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936 in direct violation of the Versailles Treaty, and the world had done nothing. He had built an air force, rebuilt his army far beyond treaty limits, and the world had looked away. Each act of aggression that went unanswered taught him the same lesson, that the appetite for conflict among the democracies of Europe was so low, the hunger for peace so desperate, that he could push further than anyone thought possible. He was right, and the next push was coming. There's a word that became, in the years between the two world wars, almost a philosophy unto itself. A word that well-meaning people wrapped themselves in like a blanket, believing it would keep the cold out. The word was appeasement. And to understand how the Second World War actually began, how it moved from a gathering darkness into a physical, exploding reality, you have to understand what appeasement was, why it felt so reasonable to the people who practiced it, and why it failed so completely. The leaders of Britain and France in the mid-1930s were not fools or cowards, though history has sometimes treated them that way. They were men who had lived through the First World War, or who governed populations that had. They knew what modern industrial warfare looked like. They had seen the casualty lists, the shell-shocked veterans, the villages that had lost every young man they had. The idea of doing it again, of sending another generation into another catastrophe, was not something they could contemplate easily. And so they made a calculation, over and over, that giving Hitler something would be better than fighting him for it. Hitler understood this perfectly. He was, whatever else he was, a gifted reader of weakness, and he had a strategy that exploited the deepest wish of the European democracies, the wish that this would all, somehow, be manageable. His first great gamble had come in March of 1936, when he ordered German troops into the Rhineland, the demilitarized buffer zone between Germany and France that had been established by the Versailles Treaty. It was, by any military measure, a bluff. The German forces had orders to retreat immediately if France resisted. The German generals were terrified. Hitler himself later admitted that the 48 hours after the troops crossed the border were the most nerve-wracking of his life. France did not resist. Britain counseled restraint, and Hitler learned the lesson he would return to again and again, that the Versailles Order could be dismantled, piece by piece, and the democracies would watch it happen. In March of 1938 came what the Germans called the Anschluss, the union of Germany and Austria. Austria, Hitler's birthplace, was absorbed into the German Reich in a matter of days. There was no war, barely even a negotiation. The Austrian government was pressured and bullied into compliance. German troops marched into what were, in many places, genuinely cheering crowds, and overnight, 7 million Austrians became Germans. The map of Europe changed, and the League of Nations, the great international body that had been created after the First World War specifically to prevent this kind of thing, did nothing. But it was the next act that became the defining symbol of appeasement, the moment that history has returned to ever since, when it wants to illustrate what happens when the hunger for peace overrides every other instinct. Czechoslovakia was, in 1938, a democracy, a real one, with a free press, an elected government, a functioning civil society. It also had, along its western and northern borders, a region called the Sudetenland, which was home to roughly 3 million ethnic Germans. Hitler claimed they were being oppressed. He demanded that the Sudetenland be handed to Germany. He gave speeches of escalating fury, setting deadlines, threatening war. And the leaders of Europe scrambled, desperately, to give him what he wanted before the shooting started. In September of 1938, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany. Flew, which was still a somewhat remarkable thing for a man of his age and position to do, to meet Hitler directly. He came back with nothing resolved. He flew again. And then, on September 29th and 30th, a conference was held in Munich. Britain, France, Italy, and Germany sat down together. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the meeting at which its fate was decided. The agreement reached at Munich gave Hitler the Sudetenland. In exchange, he promised that this was his last territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain flew home to London and stepped off the plane holding a piece of paper, the signed agreement, and told the crowd that had gathered that he believed it meant peace for our time. The crowd cheered. He was not a dishonest man. He genuinely believed it. Winston Churchill, who had been warning about Hitler for years while being largely ignored, told the House of Commons a few days later that Britain had been given a choice between war and dishonor, had chosen dishonor, and would get war anyway. He was not thanked for saying this, but he was right. In March of 1939, just 6 months after Munich, Hitler's forces occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, the part he had promised to leave alone. The paper Chamberlain had waved at the airport meant nothing. Hitler had never intended it to mean anything. And now, finally, the calculation in London and Paris began to shift. If Hitler could not be trusted to honor an agreement that he himself had signed, then there was no agreement that could be trusted. The era of appeasement was over. It had simply run out of things to give. Hitler's next target was Poland. He wanted the city of Danzig, which had been made a free city under the Versailles Treaty, and he wanted a corridor of land connecting Germany to East Prussia. Britain and France, trying to draw a line at last, guaranteed Poland's independence, a formal promise that if Germany attacked Poland, they would come to Poland's defense. But Hitler had one more diplomatic move to make, and it was perhaps the most stunning of all, not for its violence, but for its cynicism. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union announced a non-aggression pact. The world was staggered. Nazi Germany and Communist Soviet Union, ideological enemies, systems that had defined themselves in opposition to each other, had signed an agreement not to attack one another. Hitler and Stalin, two of the most ruthless men of the century, had made a deal. What the public did not know, and would not learn until after the war, was that the pact contained a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be split. The Baltic states would fall into the Soviet sphere. It was a devil's bargain between two devils, and it meant that when Germany moved against Poland, it would not have to worry about its eastern flank. 1 week later, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The assault was unlike anything Europe had seen. The Germans had developed a new way of fighting, fast, coordinated, overwhelming, that they called blitzkrieg, lightning war. It combined tank divisions moving at speed with air power, striking ahead of the ground troops, paralyzing the enemy's ability to respond before they had fully processed what was happening. The Polish army, which had cavalry units that had been trained to fight a very different kind of war, was overwhelmed within days. 2 days after the invasion began, Britain and France honored their guarantee. They declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. Poland fell in roughly 5 weeks. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, fulfilling its secret arrangement with Hitler. The Polish government fled into exile. The country was divided between its two occupiers, both of whom proceeded to treat the Polish people with a brutality that is almost incomprehensible. The Soviets deporting hundreds of thousands to Siberia, the Germans beginning a systematic campaign of terror against the Polish population that would, over the course of the war, kill approximately 1 in 5 Polish citizens. For several months after Poland fell, the war in Western Europe entered a strange, suspended phase that journalists at the time called the phony war. Britain and France had declared war, but very little actual fighting was happening on the Western Front. Both sides were watching each other. Hitler was consolidating. People in London and Paris began to wonder, cautiously, if perhaps it would not be so bad after all. The phony war ended in April of 1940 with Germany's invasion of Denmark and Norway. It ended decisively in May, when Germany launched a massive assault through the Ardennes forest, a route that French military planners had considered nearly impassable and therefore only lightly defended, outflanking the main Allied forces and driving toward the English Channel. In a matter of days, the military situation in Western Europe had become catastrophic. The British Expeditionary Force and a large portion of the French army found themselves trapped against the sea at a small port town in northern France called Dunkirk. The German armored divisions were closing in. The options available to the Allied commanders were narrowing by the hour. And then something happened that no military planner had anticipated and that no one has ever fully explained. Hitler ordered his panzer divisions to halt for several days, giving the Allies a window that should not have existed. What happened in that window became one of the most remarkable events of the entire war. The British launched an emergency evacuation, Operation Dynamo, calling on the Royal Navy and, crucially, on every civilian vessel that could cross the channel. Fishing boats, pleasure craft, ferries, riverboats. Private citizens sailed their small vessels across the English Channel into a war zone. Between May 26th and June 4th, over 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. It was a defeat. An army had been driven into the sea, but it was a defeat transformed by extraordinary human effort and a measure of luck into something that Britain could call a kind of miracle. Churchill stood before the House of Commons on June 4th and delivered words that have echoed ever since. He told them that they would fight on the beaches, that they would fight on the landing grounds, that they would fight in the fields and in the streets, that they would fight in the hills, and that they would never surrender. It was not a description of a plan. It was something older and more necessary than a plan. It was a refusal, a declaration that whatever came next, Britain would not do what France was about to do. Because France fell. On June 22nd, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany. The ceremony was held by Hitler's deliberate choice in the same railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne where Germany had signed the armistice ending the First World War in 1918. A piece of theatrical revenge that tells you everything about the nature of the grievance that had driven him. In 6 weeks, Germany had defeated France. A country that had held out for 4 years against Germany in the previous war had been brought down in 40 days. Britain now stood alone. The United States was not yet in the war. The Soviet Union was still, technically, Germany's partner. The British Empire's dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, were committed, but their resources were stretched. And Hitler, looking across the English Channel at a country that he had expected, after France's fall, to sue for peace, found instead a new prime minister who seemed to genuinely relish the fight. Winston Churchill had become prime minister on May 10th, 1940, the same day Germany launched its assault in the West, as if history had timed it deliberately. He was 65 years old, had been in and out of political favor for decades, and had spent the 1930s as a voice in the wilderness warning about exactly the thing that had now happened. He was not a simple man, or an entirely admirable one. He had views on empire and race that belonged to the darkest corners of British colonial history. But in the summer of 1940, in the specific role that history had given him, he was the right person in the right place, and he knew it. Hitler, unable to launch a land invasion of Britain without first controlling the skies above the Channel, ordered the Luftwaffe to destroy the Royal Air Force. What followed, through the summer and autumn of 1940, was the Battle of Britain, the first major military campaign fought entirely in the air. German bombers and fighters came in waves. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered and under enormous strain, met them. The young men who flew those planes, British, Canadian, Polish, Czech, South African, and pilots from a dozen other nations, fought with a ferocity and skill that gradually, painfully, turned the tide. The Luftwaffe shifted tactics and began bombing British cities directly. The Blitz, hoping to break civilian morale. London was bombed for 57 consecutive nights. Coventry was devastated. Thousands of civilians died, and the morale did not break. People slept in underground stations, carried on with their lives in the rubble, queued for bread in streets that had been destroyed the night before. There is something in the stubbornness of ordinary people under extreme pressure that tends to surprise those who count on breaking it. By October of 1940, Hitler had quietly shelved his plans to invade Britain. The Royal Air Force had not been destroyed. The crossing could not be made. Britain would remain in the war. Churchill, summing up what the RAF had done, told Parliament that never in the field of human conflict had so much been owed by so many to so few. The few he was speaking of were mostly in their early 20s, and many of them were already dead. There is a difference between a war and a crusade, and Hitler knew it. A war is fought for territory, for resources, for strategic advantage, objectives that can be negotiated, traded, satisfied. A crusade is fought for something that cannot be bargained with, something that admits no compromise, something that will not stop until it has consumed everything in its path or been destroyed itself. What Hitler launched on June 22, 1941, when he sent 3 million German soldiers across the border into the Soviet Union, was not simply a war. It was the most ambitious and most murderous crusade in modern history. He called it Operation Barbarossa, after the medieval German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and the name alone tells you something about how Hitler understood what he was doing, not as a military campaign with limited objectives, but as a civilizational struggle, a reckoning between races, a war that would determine the shape of the world for 1,000 years. He had written about it in Mein Kampf, his autobiographical manifesto, almost 20 years earlier. The East, the vast Slavic lands of the Soviet Union, was what he called Lebensraum, living space, the territory that Germany needed to become a true world power. The people who lived there were, in his ideology, subhuman, fit only to serve as slave labor or to be removed entirely. And the Soviet state itself, which he saw as a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, was to be annihilated root and branch. This was not a secret. His generals knew it. The orders they were given made it explicit. In what became known as the Commissar Order, issued before the invasion began, German soldiers were instructed to execute Soviet political officers, commissars, upon capture rather than treating them as prisoners of war. The laws of war, such as they were, would not apply in the East. This was to be a war of extermination, and that word was used without apology. The invasion began with a ferocity that even the scale of the previous campaigns had not prepared the world for. 3 army groups, North, Center, and South, drove deep into Soviet territory simultaneously along a front that stretched nearly 2,000 miles. The Soviet forces, despite warnings from British intelligence and from their own spies that an attack was coming, were catastrophically unprepared. Stalin had refused to believe that Hitler would violate their pact, and had suppressed or ignored the intelligence that contradicted his belief. When the Germans struck, they achieved a tactical surprise of devastating proportions. In the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans advanced at a pace that seemed to defy the scale of what they were attempting. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured in massive battles of encirclement at Minsk, at Kiev, at Vyazma, where entire Soviet armies were surrounded, cut off, and forced to surrender. By the end of 1941, Germany had taken prisoner approximately 3.5 million Soviet soldiers. Of those 3.5 million men, roughly 2 million would be dead within a year. Not killed in battle, but deliberately starved, shot, or worked to death in German prisoner of war camps. The decision to let Soviet prisoners die was not neglect. It was policy. And behind the advancing German lines, another kind of operation was underway. One that had been planned before the first tank crossed the border, and that represented something new in the history of human evil. Special mobile units called Einsatzgruppen, operations groups, followed the German army into the Soviet Union. Their job was not to fight soldiers. Their job was to kill civilians. Specifically, they had been tasked with the systematic murder of Jewish communities in every town and village the German forces passed through. They moved from place to place, gathered the Jewish populations, marched them to ravines or forests outside the towns, and shot them. Men, women, children, elderly, all of them. The largest single massacre took place at a ravine outside Kiev called Babi Yar. Over 2 days in September of 1941, in 36 hours, the Einsatzgruppen and their collaborators shot 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children. They were ordered to undress, to leave their belongings, to walk to the edge of the ravine, and they were shot and fell in. The operation was considered, by the commanders who reported on it, to have gone smoothly. Over the course of the war, the Einsatzgruppen and associated units would kill somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people by shooting. The first, but not the last, phase of what would become the Holocaust. It is necessary to pause here and sit with what those numbers mean, because there's a way in which very large numbers become abstract, and abstraction is a form of protection that the dead do not deserve. Each of those nearly 2 million people had a name. Each had woken up on the morning of their death, had perhaps eaten breakfast, had spoken to someone they loved. Each had a history that went back generations, a language, a set of stories, a world. All of it ended at the edge of a ditch in a forest, because a bureaucracy had decided that their existence was a problem to be solved. But even the Einsatzgruppen, operating with ruthless efficiency, could not kill fast enough for what the Nazi leadership had in mind. In January of 1942, senior Nazi officials gathered at a villa on the shores of the Wannsee Lake outside Berlin for a meeting that lasted approximately 90 minutes. The meeting had been called to coordinate what the Nazis euphemistically called the final solution to the Jewish question. What was discussed and decided at Wannsee was the logistics of murdering every Jewish person in Europe, an estimated 11 million people, listed in the meeting's notes by country, as if they were a resource to be processed. The decision to pursue systematic, industrial-scale murder had likely been made at the highest levels sometime in the second half of 1941. Wannsee was not where the decision was made, but where the machinery was coordinated, where the various branches of the German bureaucracy were brought into alignment, where transportation and administration and killing capacity were matched up and organized. The Holocaust, from this point forward, was not a series of local atrocities. It was a program with schedules and quotas and administrative oversight run by a modern state. The instrument of the program was the concentration and extermination camp system. Camps had existed in Germany since 1933. Places like Dachau, which had been built to hold political prisoners, communists, dissidents, anyone the regime wanted to remove from society. But what was built beginning in 1942 in occupied Poland was something different. These were not prisons. They were factories of death. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest. It had begun as a camp for Polish political prisoners, but it was expanded and transformed into a complex that combined a concentration camp, where prisoners performed forced labor until they died of exhaustion, disease, or deliberate murder, with an extermination facility where people were killed immediately upon arrival. Trains arrived at Auschwitz from across occupied Europe, from France, from the Netherlands, from Greece, from Hungary, from everywhere the German reach extended. Families arrived together, having been told they were being resettled. They stepped off the trains onto a platform called the ramp, and a process of selection immediately began. Those deemed fit for labor, generally able-bodied men and some women, were sent to the camp. Everyone else, the elderly, the children, the mothers who would not be separated from their children, was sent in the other direction. They were told they were going to shower and be deloused before being assigned to housing. They were given towels. They were directed into underground chambers. And then the doors were sealed, and crystallized hydrogen cyanide pellets, a commercial pesticide called Zyklon B, were dropped through openings in the ceiling. Everyone inside was dead within 20 minutes. At its peak operation, Auschwitz-Birkenau was killing 10,000 people a day. There were 5 other dedicated extermination camps, all in occupied Poland: Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. Together with Auschwitz, they were the endpoints of a continent-wide deportation system that consumed Jewish communities across Europe with a thoroughness that still seems, at this distance, almost impossible to fully comprehend. Communities that had existed for centuries, that had built synagogues and schools and libraries, that had produced poets and scientists and doctors and cobblers and tailors and farmers, were emptied, loaded onto trains, and murdered. Entire worlds were extinguished. The Jews of Europe were not the only victims of the Nazi killing apparatus, though they were its primary target and its greatest number of dead. Soviet prisoners of war died by the millions, as we have already seen. The Roma people of Europe, the Romani, were targeted for annihilation with a ferocity comparable to what was done to the Jews, and between 500,000 and 1.5 million Romani people were murdered. People with physical and mental disabilities have been killed in a Nazi euthanasia program that began even before the war, with approximately 200,000 people murdered by the state for the crime of being considered unproductive. Gay men were sent to concentration camps. Jehovah's Witnesses were imprisoned for refusing to swear allegiance to Hitler. Polish intellectuals, clergy, and community leaders were systematically executed. The Soviet Union lost, in total, somewhere between 26 and 27 million people during the war, a number so vast it is almost cosmological in its incomprehensibility. In the middle of all of this, the war itself continued to evolve, and on December 7th, 1941, it changed its shape entirely. The Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, brought the United States into the war with a suddenness and a fury that reshaped everything. America had been providing material support to Britain through a program called Lend-Lease: ships, weapons, food, fuel, while officially remaining neutral. Roosevelt had been navigating the powerful isolationist sentiment in American public opinion, a genuine and deeply held belief that Europe's wars were not America's wars, that the Atlantic Ocean was protection enough. Pearl Harbor ended that debate in a single morning. On December 8th, 1941, the United States declared war on Japan. 4 days later, in one of the most strategically baffling decisions of the entire war, Hitler declared war on the United States. He was not required to buy his alliance with Japan. The treaty only obligated Germany to come to Japan's defense if Japan was attacked, not if Japan attacked someone else. His reasons remained somewhat opaque to historians, but the effect was clear and decisive. The industrial and military power of the United States, the largest economy in the world, was now fully committed to the destruction of Nazi Germany. The war had become truly global, and the balance of it, though it would take years of blood and sacrifice to resolve, had shifted in a direction from which Germany would never recover. Back on the Eastern Front, the scale of suffering defies any easy summary. The German advance had come within sight of Moscow in the winter of 1941, close enough that some German officers claimed to have seen the spires of the Kremlin through their field glasses. But the Soviet Union did not collapse the way Hitler had predicted it would, had promised his generals it would, in a campaign he said would be over in 3 months. The Soviet state was more resilient, and the Soviet people more enduring than the Nazi ideology had allowed for. The Russian winter struck the German forces, who had not been equipped for it, because Hitler had planned for a summer victory, with a brutality that nature reserves for those who have underestimated her. And slowly, painfully, at an almost unimaginable cost, the Soviet Union began to push back. The turning point on the Eastern Front came at a city on the Volga River called Stalingrad, and the battle fought there between August of 1942 and February of 1943 was perhaps the most savage and consequential engagement in the history of warfare. The Germans and Soviets fought for the city street by street, building by building, room by room. Snipers controlled single staircases. Soldiers lived in the rubble for months. The German Sixth Army, one of the finest fighting forces in the German military, was encircled by a massive Soviet counteroffensive and slowly destroyed. On February 2nd, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered the remnants of his army to the Soviets. The first time a German field marshal had ever surrendered in battle. Of the roughly 300,000 German soldiers who had been encircled at Stalingrad, approximately 91,000 survived to be taken prisoner. Of those 91,000, only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. After Stalingrad, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front never returned to Germany. The Soviet Union had paid a price for it that no other nation in the war could have survived paying, and it had held. The war was far from over. The killing was far from over. The trains to Auschwitz would run for another 2 years. But something had broken at Stalingrad. Not the Soviet will, but the German certainty. And in the rubble of that city, amid the unthinkable suffering of both sides, the long road back had quietly, bloodily begun. There is a particular kind of hope that exists only in the middle of catastrophe. Not the bright, easy hope of peaceful times, but something harder and more desperate, forged in the knowledge of everything that has already been lost and everything that still might be saved. By the middle of 1943, that kind of hope was beginning to flicker into existence across the Allied world. The war was not won. It was nowhere near won. But for the first time since September of 1939, the direction of it had changed. The question was no longer whether Germany could be stopped. The question was how long it would take and what the stopping would cost. The cost, it turned out, would be almost incomprehensible. But the machinery of Allied power was now fully engaged, and it moved with a force and a scale that the Axis powers, for all their early dominance, could not ultimately match. In North Africa, the war had been grinding back and forth across the desert for 2 years, a campaign that sometimes seemed almost detached from the European slaughter, fought across vast distances of sand and rock between armored forces that moved like ships across an ocean. The German commander Erwin Rommel had earned a reputation as a tactical genius, earning the nickname the Desert Fox, pushing the British forces back toward Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal and the entire Allied position in the Middle East. But by late 1942, the tide had turned there too. At the Second Battle of El Alamein, in October and November of 1942, the British Eighth Army under General Bernard Montgomery broke through the German lines and began a pursuit westward that would not end until the Axis forces in North Africa were trapped between Montgomery's army from the east and the American forces that had landed in Morocco and Algeria in November of 1942. In May of 1943, the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms, a defeat comparable in scale to Stalingrad, and one that cleared the way for the next phase of the Allied strategy. That next phase was Sicily, and then Italy itself. In July of 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily, and within 5 weeks had taken the island. The Italian campaign that followed was one of the most grinding and costly of the entire war. Italy's mountainous terrain gave defending forces a natural advantage that the Germans exploited with extraordinary skill, turning every river valley and hilltop village into a fortress that had to be taken yard by yard. The Italian campaign would last until the final days of the war in Europe, consuming Allied resources and lives at a rate that sometimes made its strategic value seem questionable. But it kept German forces tied down in the south, and it achieved one thing of immediate political significance. It brought down Mussolini. Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator who had allied Italy with Germany and who had, in many ways, provided the template that Hitler had adapted and radicalized, was voted out of power by his own Grand Council on July 25, 1943, and arrested by order of the Italian king. Italy, quietly, and then not so quietly, began negotiating a surrender to the Allies. Germany responded by occupying northern and central Italy, turning its former ally into a conquered territory. Mussolini was rescued from his mountain prison by German commandos in a daring glider operation, and was installed as the puppet leader of a German-controlled rump state in northern Italy. He would end his life 2 years later, shot by Italian partisans and hung upside down from the roof of a petrol station in Milan. But the campaign that everyone knew would be decisive, the campaign that Churchill had been resisting and Stalin had been demanding and the American military had been planning for years, was the invasion of northwestern France. The cross-channel attack, Operation Overlord, D-Day. The planning for the Normandy landings was the largest and most complex military planning operation in history. It involved coordination between the armies, navies, and air forces of multiple nations, the construction of artificial harbors to be towed across the channel, the training of hundreds of thousands of soldiers in amphibious assault techniques, and an elaborate and brilliantly executed deception operation designed to convince the Germans that the real invasion would land not at Normandy, but at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the channel, where the Germans had their strongest defenses. The deception operation, called Operation Fortitude, involved fake armies, fake radio traffic, double agents feeding false information to German intelligence, and the deliberate use of General George Patton, whom the Germans believed to be the most dangerous Allied commander, as the notional leader of a fictional army group supposedly poised to cross at Calais. It worked with a thoroughness that still astonishes. Even after the landings at Normandy began, Hitler held back his panzer reserves for weeks, convinced the real invasion was still coming at Calais. June 6, 1944. The day began in the dark, before dawn, with paratroopers dropping behind the German lines in Normandy. American, British, and Canadian soldiers falling through the night sky onto French fields and hedgerows, many of them scattered miles from their objectives, fighting in small groups in the darkness against an enemy they could hear but often not see. It was chaotic and costly, and in many places nearly catastrophic. But it secured the flanks of the beaches, disrupted German communications and prevented the rapid deployment of reinforcements to the coast. As dawn broke, the largest naval armada in human history appeared off the Normandy coast. Nearly 7,000 ships of every kind, battleships, destroyers, landing craft, minesweepers, hospital ships, stretched along the horizon. The naval guns opened up on the German fortifications along the beach. The bombers came over, and then the landing craft dropped their ramps and the men went into the water. 5 beaches have been designated with code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. At most of them, the assault was extraordinarily difficult, but ultimately successful. At Omaha Beach, it came close to failing entirely. The bombing runs that were supposed to destroy the German fortifications had missed in the cloud and darkness, dropping their bombs miles inland. The specialized tanks that were supposed to support the infantry had been launched too far out in rough seas, and most had sunk before reaching the shore. The men of the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions waded onto a beach swept by machine gun fire from fortified positions above them. With almost no cover, no armor support, and nowhere to go but forward. The casualties at Omaha in the first hours were devastating. Men died in the water before they reached the sand. They died on the sand. They died at the base of the bluffs. And still they went forward because there was nowhere else to go, and because the men behind them were coming whether the men in front moved or not. By the end of the day, American forces had established a tenuous foothold on Omaha at the cost of somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 casualties in a single day on a single beach. The exact number has never been precisely established. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, approximately 156,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. The foothold was narrow and precarious, and the Germans would contest every mile of the breakout with ferocity. But the foothold existed. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. The weeks that followed were some of the bloodiest of the entire Western campaign. The Norman hedgerow country, the bocage, was a defender's paradise, a maze of ancient earthen banks topped with thick vegetation that channeled attacking forces into killing grounds and negated much of the Allied advantage in armor and firepower. Progress was measured in fields and lanes, not miles. The city of Cannes, which had been an objective for the first day of the invasion, was not fully in Allied hands until late July, nearly 2 months after D-Day. But in late July, the American forces finally broke through at St. Lo in an operation called Cobra, and the nature of the campaign changed. The German lines, stretched and battered by weeks of attritional fighting, cracked. Patton's Third Army poured through the gap and began moving at speed across France, covering ground in days that the previous weeks had measured in yards. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944, when French forces, specifically and deliberately a French armored division, were given the honor of leading the liberation of the French capital. General Charles de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées before the shooting had fully stopped, as crowds lined the streets in a delirium of joy and relief that had been building for 4 years. There were still snipers on the rooftops. He walked anyway. As the Western Allies drove eastward through France and the Soviets drove westward through Poland and Eastern Europe, the Nazi regime found itself in a closing vice. And within that regime, something was shifting. Not among the true believers, the Himmlers and the Goebbels, who would fight to the last and die with the ideology still intact inside them, but among some of the military officers, men who had served Germany all their professional lives, and who could now see, with the cold clarity that imminent defeat provides, that Hitler was leading the country to total destruction. On July 20th, 1944, a group of German military officers attempted to assassinate Hitler. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, a decorated officer who had been severely wounded in North Africa, carried a briefcase containing a bomb into a conference room at Hitler's military headquarters in East Prussia and left it under the table before slipping out of the room. The bomb exploded. 4 people were killed. Hitler survived, protected by the heavy oak table leg that had deflected the blast. The aftermath was swift and merciless. The Gestapo rolled up the conspiracy with methodical brutality. Approximately 5,000 people were arrested. Nearly 200 were executed, many of them by being hanged with piano wire for meat hooks, a method Hitler personally specified because he wanted their deaths to be degrading. The executions were filmed so that Hitler could watch them. Rommel, the Desert Fox, was implicated in the conspiracy and was given a choice: a show trial that would destroy his family, or suicide with a state funeral and his family protected. He chose the poison capsule, and Germany was told he had died of his wounds from an earlier Allied air attack. The July 20th plot was the closest anyone came to removing Hitler from within, and its failure meant that the war and the killing would continue until the very last possible moment. The Holocaust was continuing in parallel with all of this. The train's still running, the crematoria still burning, even as the military situation deteriorated around it. There is something important to understand about this, something that tells you what the Holocaust actually was at its core. In the final year of the war, as Germany was being crushed from east and west, as Allied bombers were destroying German cities, as the Wehrmacht was retreating on every front and fuel and ammunition were desperately scarce, the Nazi regime continued to devote railway capacity and administrative resources to the deportation and murder of Jews. Hungarian Jews, approximately 437,000 of them, were deported to Auschwitz in the summer of 1944 and murdered, the largest single deportation of the Holocaust, carried out at a speed that required Auschwitz to operate at maximum capacity around the clock. This was happening while Germany was losing the war. The murder of the Jews was not incidental to the Nazi project. It was central to it. It continued even when it made no military or economic sense, even when the resources it consumed might have prolonged Germany's resistance. It continued because for those who ran it, it was the point. In January of 1945, as Soviet forces approached from the east, the SS began evacuating the concentration camps, forcing the surviving prisoners on what became known as death marches, moving them westward in winter conditions with no food, no shelter, and orders that no prisoner should be allowed to fall into Allied hands alive. Tens of thousands died on these marches, shot when they fell, or simply dying of cold and exhaustion in the snow. The camps were liberated one by one as the Allied forces advanced. Soviet soldiers entered Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, and found approximately 7,000 prisoners still alive, those too weak to be marched. They found warehouses containing the belongings of the murdered, 14,000 pounds of human hair, hundreds of thousands of suits and dresses, tens of thousands of pairs of shoes. They found the gas chambers and the crematoria, partially demolished by the SS in an attempt to destroy the evidence. British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen in April, and the footage that their cameramen took there of the mass graves of the skeletal survivors, of the piles of bodies, shocked the world in a way that no written account had managed to do. American forces liberated Dachau and Buchenwald, and the soldiers who walked through the gates reported that they could smell the camps from miles away. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, visited the camps personally and ordered that as many soldiers, journalists, and German civilians as possible should also be brought to see them. He wrote that he wanted the evidence documented with every possible means, because he foresaw the day when someone would claim that it had never happened. He was right to foresee it. That day came. Hitler died in his underground bunker in Berlin on April 30th, 1945, with Soviet forces fighting in the streets above him by his own hand. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8th, 1945, a day celebrated across the Allied world as Victory in Europe Day, V-Day. The war in Europe was over, but the war was not over. In the Pacific, a different kind of conflict had been grinding forward for years, and it was moving toward an ending that no one had ever witnessed before, and that would change the nature of human existence itself. That ending is where our story goes next. Stay with us. To understand the atomic bomb, you have to first understand the war that made it necessary, or at least made it feel necessary. And to understand that war, you have to go back to a place and a moment that most Western tellings of the Second World War treat as a beginning, but which was, for the people living through it, already very much in the middle. Japan had been at war since 1931. Not the war that began in Europe in 1939, not the global conflict that Pearl Harbor ignited in December of 1941, but its own war, an imperial expansion across Asia and the Pacific that had been building for decades and that had already consumed millions of lives before a single German soldier crossed into Poland. To understand why the Pacific War ended the way it did, you have to hold that context in mind. By the time American forces were island hopping across the Pacific, Japan had been a nation at war, in one form or another, for over a decade. Japan in the early 20th century was a country navigating a profound and painful tension. It had modernized with extraordinary speed in the decades following the Meiji Restoration of 1868, transforming itself from a feudal society into an industrial power in a single generation, building a modern military, a modern navy, a modern economy. It had defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, the first time in the modern era that an Asian nation had defeated a European power in a major conflict, and the shock waves of that victory had traveled across the colonial world. Japan was powerful, Japan was modern, and yet Japan found itself, in the international order of the early 20th century, treated as a second-tier power by the Western nations that controlled the global system, denied the racial equality clause it had sought at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, limited in its naval capacity by treaties that Japan felt were designed to keep it subordinate, shut out of the natural resources it needed to sustain its industrial economy by a world in which the British, French, and Dutch empires controlled the raw materials of Asia. The response to this frustration, as it hardened through the 1920s and 1930s into something more militant and more dangerous, was a conviction among Japan's military leadership that the solution was empire, that Japan must build its own sphere of resource and influence in Asia, by force if necessary, and that the Western powers who stood in the way of this vision must be confronted rather than accommodated. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was the first step. Japanese forces seized the northeastern Chinese region, established a puppet state, and when the League of Nations condemned the action, Japan simply withdrew from the League and continued. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China proper, beginning a war of extraordinary brutality that would ultimately kill somewhere between 8 and 20 million Chinese people. A range so wide it reflects not uncertainty about the horror, but the near impossibility of counting the dead when the killing is so vast and so prolonged. The Nanjing Massacre of December 1937 and January 1938 became one of the defining atrocities of the entire war. Japanese forces captured the Chinese capital of Nanjing and over the following weeks killed somewhere between 40,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. The range of estimates reflects the chaos of the killing and the deliberate destruction of evidence. Women were raped in numbers that historians have struggled to document precisely because the survivors were often killed afterward. The city was looted and burned. International observers, sheltering in a designated safety zone, wrote accounts that they sent to the world, and the world reacted with horror and did very little. By 1940, Japan had allied itself with Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact, joining the Axis. By 1941, with Germany having conquered France and the Netherlands, Japan moved to occupy French Indochina, modern Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, positioning itself for further expansion into the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. The United States responded with economic sanctions and, ultimately, an oil embargo that cut off approximately 80% of Japan's oil supply. For a nation that had no significant domestic oil reserves and whose military machine ran entirely on imported fuel, this was an existential threat. Japan's military planners calculated that without oil, their war in China would be unsustainable within 2 years. The solution they chose was not to withdraw from China. It was to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, and to neutralize the American fleet at Pearl Harbor before it could intervene. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, launched by 6 Japanese aircraft carriers operating in radio silence across the North Pacific, was tactically brilliant and strategically catastrophic. In approximately 2 hours of attack, the Japanese sank or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. It was the most devastating surprise attack in American military history. But it failed to destroy the American aircraft carriers, which were at sea on the day of the attack, and which would prove to be the decisive weapons of the Pacific War. And it transformed American public opinion overnight, ending the isolationist debate with the finality of an explosion. The sleeping giant, as Japanese Admiral Yamamoto reportedly feared he had awakened, was now fully awake and furious. The Pacific War in its first 6 months was a cascade of Japanese victories. The Philippines fell, Malaya and Singapore fell. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 being perhaps the greatest military humiliation in British imperial history, with 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendering to a Japanese force that was actually smaller in number and nearly out of ammunition. Burma fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. Japan had, in a matter of months, built the empire it had sought, stretching across an ocean. But the turning point came in June of 1942, at a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific called Midway. American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval code and knew that a large Japanese fleet was heading for Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz set a trap. In a battle that lasted 4 days and turned on a series of moments so narrow they seemed to hinge on individual decisions made in the space of seconds, the United States Navy sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the same for that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, while losing one of its own. Midway was the pivot of the Pacific War. Japan never fully recovered the naval air power it lost there, and the strategic initiative, slowly and at enormous cost, began to shift. What followed was an island-hopping campaign of grinding ferocity, a series of assaults on Japanese-held islands across the Pacific, each one a fortress, each one defended by Japanese soldiers who had been trained in a military culture that considered surrender to be the deepest possible dishonor. The island battles had a quality unlike the fighting in Europe, an intensity of close combat, in jungles and on beaches and in cave systems, where the normal conventions of warfare, seemed to dissolve entirely. At Guadalcanal, the first major American offensive operation of the Pacific War, the fighting lasted 6 months across jungle so dense and disease so prevalent that nearly as many men were evacuated for illness as for wounds. At Tarawa, a tiny atoll barely 2 miles long, nearly 1,000 Americans were killed in 76 hours assaulting a garrison of Japanese defenders who fought almost literally to the last man. Of nearly 4,800 Japanese defenders, 17 surrendered. At Iwo Jima, a volcanic island of sulfur and black sand, 6,800 Americans were killed and nearly 20,000 wounded in a month of fighting against an enemy who had built an underground fortress of tunnels and bunkers that aerial bombardment and naval gunfire had barely touched. The famous photograph of American Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi was taken on the 5th day of a battle that lasted another month. And at every island, the same pattern held. The Japanese defenders fought to the death. They launched banzai charges rather than surrender. They chose suicide over capture. Civilian populations on the islands, who had been told by Japanese authorities that American soldiers would torture and murder them, sometimes leaped from cliff tops rather than fall into American hands. At Saipan in 1944, hundreds of Japanese civilians died this way, throwing themselves and their children from the cliffs at the island's northern tip as American forces approached. The Americans watching from below, many of them fathers themselves, were horrified and helpless. This was the context in which American military planners began preparing for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. The operation was called Downfall, and the casualty estimates attached to it were staggering. American planners projected American casualties alone of somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million, depending on the level of Japanese resistance. Japanese military and civilian casualties were projected in the millions. Japan had approximately 2 million soldiers on the home islands and was training civilians, men, women, and children, in the use of bamboo spears and improvised weapons to resist the invasion. There were stockpiles of poison gas. There were thousands of Kaiten, man torpedoes, human-guided suicide weapons. The kamikaze attacks that had already killed thousands of American sailors off Okinawa, where American forces had suffered nearly 50,000 casualties in the last major island battle before the home islands, will be multiplied by an order of magnitude. The people making the decision about whether to use the atomic bomb were looking at these projections. They were men who had watched the Pacific War for nearly 4 years and understood, in their bones, what Japanese resistance looked like and how far it would go. They were also men who understood what the bomb was, or at least what it could do, because no one had ever actually dropped one on a city before and no one knew precisely what would happen. The bomb existed because of a letter written in August of 1939, when the war in Europe had not yet begun. The letter was written by Albert Einstein, though largely drafted by his fellow physicist Leo Szilard, and addressed to President Franklin Roosevelt. It warned that recent research in nuclear physics had made it theoretically possible to construct an extremely powerful new type of bomb, and that Germany might already be working on one. Einstein and Szilard urged Roosevelt to ensure that the United States did not fall behind. Roosevelt acted on the letter, and what began as a small research program grew, after Pearl Harbor, into the most expensive and secretive scientific and industrial enterprise in American history. It was called the Manhattan Project, and at its peak it employed approximately 130,000 people across dozens of facilities spread across the country. A city-sized operation that most of the people who worked in it did not fully understand, because the project was so compartmentalized that individual workers often knew only their own small piece of it. The scientific heart of the project was at Los Alamos, New Mexico, a remote mesa in the desert where the theoretical and practical physics of the bomb was worked out under the direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist of extraordinary brilliance who had never built anything more complex than a piece of laboratory equipment, and who somehow became the leader of the most complex technical project in human history. Around him, Oppenheimer assembled the greatest concentration of scientific talent ever gathered in one place. Refugees from Nazi Europe, brilliant young Americans, established figures from every major university. They lived in a secret city. Their mail was censored, their movements were monitored, and they worked with the focused intensity of people who knew or believed that Germany was working on the same problem, and that whoever got there first would win the war. Germany, it turned out, was not as close as they feared. The German nuclear program had been hampered by a combination of factors: the loss of Jewish scientists who had fled the Reich, strategic decisions that had directed resources elsewhere, and a crucial act of sabotage in Norway in 1943 when a small group of Norwegian resistance fighters, trained by the British, destroyed a facility producing heavy water that the German program depended on. By the time the European war ended, Germany was years away from a working bomb. But the scientists at Los Alamos did not know this for certain while they were working, and the fear of a German bomb drove them forward with an urgency that did not diminish. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico at a test site called Trinity, the world's first nuclear device was detonated. The flash was visible 200 miles away. The heat at the center of the explosion was 3 times hotter than the surface of the sun. The blast wave knocked observers off their feet 10 miles from the detonation point. A steel tower 100 feet tall, at the center of the explosion, was vaporized, not destroyed, not knocked over, but simply erased from existence. Oppenheimer, watching the fireball rise into the desert sky, later said that a line from Hindu scripture had come into his mind. He was the most educated man at the site, and perhaps the most haunted by what he had just witnessed. The words he remembered were from the Bhagavad Gita: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The bomb worked, and the decision about whether and how to use it was about to become the most consequential choice of the 20th century. The decision was made, and what followed changed the world in ways that are still unfolding around us today. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the end of the Pacific War, and a long shadow that the nuclear age cast over everything that came after, including the space race and the Cuban Missile Crisis that are still ahead of us in this story. All of it flows from that moment in the New Mexico desert when the fireball rose into the sky. There is a particular weight that attaches itself to decisions that cannot be undone. Most decisions in life exist in a world of revision. You can apologize, you can change course, you can try again. But some decisions, once made, alter the fabric of reality permanently, and everyone who comes after lives in the world that decision created, whether they know it or not. The decision to drop atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 is perhaps the most complete example of that kind of decision in all of modern history. Whatever you believe about whether it was right or wrong or necessary or criminal, and serious, thoughtful people have argued all of those positions with genuine force. The world that existed after those 2 bombs fell was a fundamentally different world from the one that existed before. The difference was not merely in the destruction, enormous as that was. The difference was in what humanity now knew about itself and what it was capable of building and using. The decision was made by Harry Truman, who had become President of the United States on April 12, 1945, when Franklin Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia. Truman had been vice president for only 82 days. He had not been told about the Manhattan Project. On his first full day as president, Secretary of War Henry Stimson took him aside and told him, carefully and in general terms, that the United States was developing a weapon of almost unbelievable destructive force. Truman later said he felt as though the sun, the moon, and the stars had all fallen on him. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered, but Japan had not, and showed no signs of doing so. The firebombing campaigns against Japanese cities have been devastating. A single night of conventional bombing against Tokyo in March of 1945 had killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city, making it one of the most destructive air raids in history. And still Japan had not surrendered. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had demonstrated, at terrible cost, what the invasion of the home islands would mean. The kamikaze attacks at Okinawa had sunk or damaged hundreds of American ships and killed nearly 5,000 American sailors. And American intelligence estimated that Japan had approximately 10,000 kamikaze aircraft remaining, held in reserve for the invasion. Truman convened a panel of advisors to consider the options. The alternatives to the bomb that were discussed included a naval blockade combined with continued conventional bombing, a demonstration of the bomb on an uninhabited area to shock Japan into surrender, and a full-scale land invasion. The blockade option was considered too slow. Estimates suggested it could take years, and the Japanese civilian population was already starving, which raised its own moral complications. The demonstration option was rejected partly because there were only 2 bombs ready, and if Japan did not surrender after a demonstration, the element of shock would be lost. The invasion option carried the casualty projections that Truman found unacceptable. There was also a 4th factor that shaped the decision, one that is sometimes underemphasized in American accounts of this moment. The Soviet Union had agreed, at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. Germany surrendered on May 8th. The Soviet deadline was therefore early August. American planners were not entirely comfortable with the prospect of Soviet forces pouring into Manchuria and potentially claiming a share of the occupation of Japan the way they had claimed share of Germany. Using the bomb and ending the war quickly, before the Soviets could establish a significant military presence in the Pacific theater, was not the primary reason for the decision, but it was a factor that shaped its timing. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, took off from the island of Tinian in the Mariana Islands and flew northwest toward Japan. In its bomb bay was a uranium bomb called Little Boy. At 8:15 in the morning, local time, over the city of Hiroshima, the bomb was released. Hiroshima was a city of approximately 350,000 people. It was a military headquarters and a significant industrial center, which was why it had been chosen from target lists that had been carefully constructed to include cities that had not yet been heavily bombed, partly for military reasons and partly with a cold logic that is difficult to sit with, because undamaged cities would provide cleaner data on the bomb's effects. The city had been spared the conventional bombing that had devastated Tokyo and Osaka and dozens of other Japanese cities, and many of its residents had noticed this and wondered why. They got their answer at 8:15 in the morning. Little Boy detonated at an altitude of approximately 1,900 feet above the city, and in a fraction of a second, a fireball with a temperature at its center of several million degrees Celsius expanded outward. Within a mile of the detonation point, virtually everything was instantly destroyed. Buildings were vaporized or collapsed. People directly beneath the explosion were incinerated so completely that in some cases their shadows, the shapes of their bodies, were burned permanently into the stone surfaces they had been standing near, as the intense thermal flash scorched everything around them while their bodies briefly blocked the radiation. These shadow people, as they came to be called, are among the most haunting artifacts of the entire war. The blast wave that followed the initial fireball traveled outward at hundreds of miles per hour, flattening buildings, throwing people through the air, collapsing everything that the heat had not already destroyed. Then came the fires, dozens of individual fires merging into a single firestorm that consumed what remained of the city. Then came the black rain, dark, radioactive moisture that fell from the mushroom cloud onto the survivors, contaminating water and skin. Of the approximately 350,000 people in Hiroshima that morning, somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 were killed instantly or within hours. By the end of 1945, the death toll had risen to somewhere between 90,000 and 166,000, as people who had survived the initial blast died from burns, injuries, and the effects of radiation sickness, a condition that many survivors had never heard of and did not understand, and which killed them slowly and painfully in the weeks that followed, their hair falling out, their bodies bleeding internally, their immune systems collapsing. Japan did not surrender immediately. The Japanese Supreme War Council met and debated. There were those who argued, even now, that Japan must continue to fight. The military leadership spoke of dying with honor, of making the cost of invasion so high that America would negotiate rather than continue. The Emperor, Hirohito, was present but largely silent. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb, a plutonium bomb called Fat Man, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. The original target that day had been the city of Kokura, but cloud cover over Kokura led the crew to their secondary target. Nagasaki's hilly terrain contained the blast somewhat compared to Hiroshima's flat delta, but the destruction was still catastrophic. Somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people killed, a significant portion of the city destroyed, the same horrifying pattern of burns and blast injuries and radiation sickness among the survivors. On the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria, overwhelming the Japanese forces there with a speed and force that shattered any remaining Japanese hope that the Soviets might mediate a negotiated peace. Japan was now being struck from multiple directions simultaneously, with weapons it had no answer for. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio, the first time most of them had ever heard his voice, which was itself an extraordinary and disorienting experience for a population that had been taught to regard their emperor as divine. He told them, in formal court language so archaic that many ordinary Japanese people struggled to understand it, that Japan would endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable. He did not use the word surrender, but the meaning was clear. Japan was ending the war. The formal surrender was signed on September 2, 1945, on the deck of the American battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, with General Douglas MacArthur presiding over a ceremony of deliberate dignity. The Second World War was over. 6 years and 1 day after Germany had invaded Poland, the most destructive conflict in human history had ended. The final death toll, military and civilian, across all theaters, has never been precisely established because precision is impossible in a catastrophe of that scale. The most widely cited estimates suggest somewhere between 70 and 85 million people died in the Second World War, representing approximately 3% of the entire world population in 1940. More civilians died than soldiers, which was itself something new in the history of warfare. The world that emerged from the war was physically, politically, and psychologically transformed in ways that are still shaping us today. Europe lay in ruins, its cities bombed, its infrastructure destroyed, its populations displaced, its ancient political order shattered. The European colonial empires, which had defined the global order for centuries, had been fatally weakened. India would gain independence in 1947. The colonial world was beginning its long and often violent process of decolonization. The United States and the Soviet Union, the two powers that had done the most to win the war, from their very different sides of it, emerged as the dominant forces in a world that was now organized around their rivalry. And there was the bomb. The bomb changed everything in ways that went beyond its immediate destruction. It had demonstrated that human beings could now build weapons capable of destroying cities in a single instant, and that the knowledge of how to build such weapons, once acquired, could never be unacquired. The genie, as people said at the time, was out of the bottle. The question that replaced all previous military and political questions was a new one, and it was terrifying in its simplicity. What happens when more than one country has these weapons? The Soviet Union had been watching the Manhattan Project with great interest, not from the outside, but partially from the inside. Soviet intelligence had penetrated the project with several agents, the most significant of whom was a British physicist named Klaus Fuchs, who had fled Nazi Germany and become a naturalized British citizen and a senior scientist at Los Alamos. Fuchs passed detailed technical information about the bomb's design to Soviet agents throughout his time at Los Alamos. He was not motivated by money. He was a committed communist who believed that giving the Soviet Union nuclear capability would prevent American nuclear monopoly and ultimately make the world safer. Whether he was right about that, in the very long view of history, is a question that serious people still debate. The Soviets also had information from other sources, and they had their own brilliant physicists. On August 29, 1949, 4 years after Hiroshima, and 3 years earlier than American intelligence had predicted, the Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear device at a test site in Kazakhstan. President Truman announced it to the American public with a statement whose brevity masked the enormity of what it meant. The nuclear monopoly was over. The arms race had begun. The United States responded by developing the hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon that used a fission explosion as a trigger to ignite a fusion reaction, producing a blast thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. The first American hydrogen bomb test, in November 1952, vaporized an entire island in the Pacific Marshall Islands chain, not damaged it, not destroyed it, but removed it from the surface of the ocean entirely. The Soviet Union tested its own hydrogen bomb less than a year later. By the mid-1950s, both superpowers possessed weapons capable of destroying entire cities. Not just buildings and people, but the very geography, the ground itself, and both were building more. The doctrine that emerged from this situation had an acronym that was also, with a grim appropriateness, a word: MAD, mutually assured destruction. The theory was that if both sides knew that any nuclear attack would result in a retaliatory strike that would destroy the attacker as completely as the defender, neither side would ever strike first. The peace of the nuclear age would be maintained not by goodwill or diplomacy or international law, but by the certainty of mutual annihilation. It was, as many people noted at the time, a deeply insane way to organize the peace. But it worked in the specific sense that the bombs were never used again. It worked, that is, until a series of moments arrived when it came terrifyingly close to not working. But those moments are part of the next chapter of this story. What the nuclear age also produced, with an irony that is almost too neat for fiction, was one of the most extraordinary adventures in human history. The race to leave the planet entirely, to push beyond the atmosphere into the void of space, to plant flags and claim first in a realm that no human being had ever reached. The space race was born directly from the same technology that had created the nuclear bomb. The rocket science that could deliver a warhead across a continent could also, with modification and enormous ambition, push a metal sphere and then a living creature, and then a human being beyond the pole of the Earth itself. And it was born from the same rivalry, the same grinding, watchful, dangerous competition between the United States and the Soviet Union that gave the second half of the 20th century its defining shape and tension. The Cold War, as it came to be called, was the context for everything that followed. And understanding it requires understanding not just the weapons and the politics, but the fear, the particular, pervasive daily fear of a generation that grew up knowing that the civilization they lived in could be ended, not gradually, not over years of war, but in an afternoon. That fear shaped everything. It shaped foreign policy and domestic politics and popular culture and architecture and education. It shaped the dreams that politicians sold and the nightmares that kept ordinary people awake. And out of that fear and that rivalry and that extraordinary human impulse to go further and higher than anyone has gone before came the space race. One of the most remarkable things our species has ever done. There is something in the human animal that has always looked up. Before there were cities or writing or agriculture, before any of the structures we call civilization had been built, human beings were lying on their backs in the dark and watching the stars move across the sky and feeling something that was equal parts wonder and longing. The stars were unreachable, and perhaps that was part of what made them beautiful, the clean, permanent impossibility of them. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, in the span of a single human lifetime, the impossible became merely very difficult, and then became done. The space race did not begin in wonder. It began in fear, and in the specific, grinding anxiety of two superpowers watching each other across an ideological divide, each convinced that the other's technological superiority could mean annihilation. To understand why two nations poured such extraordinary resources, human, financial, and intellectual, into the project of leaving the Earth, you have to understand the world they were trying to leave behind, at least temporarily. A world in which both sides had nuclear weapons, both sides had bombers that could cross continents, and both sides were working frantically on the technology that would make those bombers obsolete. The ballistic missile, a rocket that could carry a nuclear warhead from one side of the planet to the other in less than 30 minutes, flying through space itself, beyond the reach of any existing defense. The technology of the space race and the technology of nuclear delivery were not parallel developments. They were the same development, viewed from two different angles. The rocket that could put a satellite into orbit was, with relatively modest modification, the rocket that could drop a warhead on a city. This is why the space race was never merely a scientific competition or a propaganda exercise, though it was both of those things too. At its core, it was a military competition dressed in the clothes of exploration, and the stakes attached to it were existential. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had, at the end of the Second World War, scrambled to acquire the human and technical expertise behind Germany's rocket program. The Germans had developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, which had rained down on London and Antwerp in the final year of the war, killing thousands of civilians and demonstrating for the first time that it was possible to deliver explosive warheads across hundreds of miles without an aircraft. The V-2 was crude by later standards, but it was a proof of concept that both superpowers immediately recognized as transformative. The man most responsible for the V-2 was a German engineer named Wernher von Braun, a tall, charming, extraordinarily gifted rocket scientist who had been dreaming about space travel since he was a teenager reading science fiction, and who had made the deeply compromised decision to work for the Nazi regime because it was the only organization willing to fund his rockets on the scale he needed. Von Braun was a member of the Nazi Party and held an SS officer's rank. The V-2 rockets were built using slave labor from concentration camps, and thousands of concentration camp prisoners died building them. More, in fact, than the rockets killed when they landed on their targets. Von Braun's culpability for this is a question that historians have debated for decades, with conclusions that range from direct complicity to willful blindness. What is not debated is that he knew. At the end of the war, von Braun made a deliberate choice to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets, reasoning that the Americans would make better use of his talents and treat him better in the process. He and over 100 of his top engineers were brought to the United States in a secret operation called Paperclip, their Nazi past quietly buried beneath the urgency of Cold War need. They were given jobs, salaries, and eventually citizenship. The moral discomfort of this arrangement was acknowledged privately by some of the American officials involved and then set aside. The rockets were too important. The Soviets had their own rocket genius, and he was in many ways an even more remarkable figure, partly because for decades almost no one in the Western world knew his name. His name was Sergei Korolev, and he was the chief designer, a title deliberately vague, deliberately anonymous, because the Soviet state did not want its enemies to know who was responsible for its rocket program, and therefore did not want his name in public. Korolev had spent years in the Soviet Gulag, the prison camp system, having been arrested during Stalin's purges in the late 1930s on charges that were essentially fabricated. He had survived the camps, which many did not, and had been released when the Soviet state realized it needed his expertise. He returned to his work with a focus that his colleagues described as almost supernatural, as if the years in the Gulag had burned away everything in him that was not rocket science. Korolev and von Braun never met. They worked in total secrecy on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain, each aware that the other existed, each driven by the same deep passion for space that had preceded and would outlast the Cold War that was currently funding their work. They were, in a sense, the two poles of the space race, the human beings most responsible for what it achieved, and history has treated them very differently, partly because one of them spent his career in a democracy with a free press, and the other spent his in a state that kept his existence classified until after his death. The opening shot of the space race was fired on October 4th, 1957, and it was fired by the Soviets, and the sound it made, metaphorically speaking, was a simple, steady beeping that traveled around the world and changed everything. Sputnik. The word means fellow traveler in Russian, and it was the name given to a polished metal sphere about the size of a beach ball, weighing 183 pounds, fitted with 4 radio antennas, and a simple transmitter that broadcast a repeating beep on a frequency that amateur radio operators around the world could pick up. Korolev's team launched it on an R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile, the same missile that was designed to carry nuclear warheads, and it entered orbit at an altitude of approximately 140 miles, circling the Earth every 96 minutes. The reaction in the United States was something between alarm and panic. Not because Sputnik itself was dangerous. A metal sphere beeping overhead was not a weapon, but because of what it implied. If the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere on Earth. The missile gap, the fear that the Soviet Union was ahead in ballistic missile capability, became the dominant anxiety of American strategic thinking almost overnight. President Eisenhower, who had been privately briefed on American satellite programs and knew that the United States was not as far behind as the public feared, struggled to project calm in the face of a political firestorm. The Soviets followed Sputnik with Sputnik 2, launched just 1 month later, and this one carried a passenger, a small mixed-breed dog named Laika, who became the first living creature to orbit the Earth. Laika did not survive the mission. The technology to bring her back did not yet exist, and she died within hours of launch from overheating, though Soviet authorities did not reveal this for decades, instead claiming she had lived for several days before being humanely euthanized. The truth, when it finally emerged, added a layer of sadness to what had already been a poignant story. Laika had been selected from the stray dogs of Moscow, chosen partly because strays were considered to be tougher and more adaptable than pets. She spent her short life in space looking out of her small porthole at a planet she would never return to, and the image of her, small and trusting in her capsule, became one of the iconic images of the entire space age. The United States launched its first successful satellite, Explorer 1, in January of 1958, and in doing so made a significant scientific discovery, detecting the radiation belts that surround the Earth, which were subsequently named the Van Allen belts after the scientist who designed the experiment. But the first milestone had gone to the Soviets, and the pressure on the American space program was enormous. NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was created in 1958 specifically to coordinate and accelerate the American space effort, pulling together research programs that had been scattered across military branches and civilian agencies. The military rivalry that had started the space race was now being supplemented by something else, a genuine scientific and exploratory ambition, a sense that the project to go into space was not merely strategic but historic, not merely necessary, but magnificent. The next great milestone arrived on April 12, 1961, and again it went to the Soviets. A 27-year-old Soviet Air Force pilot named Yuri Gagarin climbed into a small spherical capsule called Vostok 1, was launched into orbit on a modified R-7 missile, circled the Earth once in 108 minutes, and landed by parachute in a field in the Russian steppe, having become the first human being in history to travel to space. The entire mission lasted less than 2 hours. Gagarin ejected from his capsule at approximately 23,000 feet and parachuted down separately, a detail that Soviet authorities concealed for years because the rules for aviation records at the time required the pilot to land with their vehicle, and the Soviets did not want to disqualify the record. Gagarin's flight was a triumph of engineering and human courage, and the world responded to it with something that transcended Cold War rivalry, a genuine, widespread sense of awe that a human being had been to space and come back alive. Gagarin himself became one of the most celebrated people on the planet, a symbol not just of Soviet achievement, but of human achievement. Modest and charming and possessed of a smile that photographs transmitted across the world with an ease that propaganda alone could not have manufactured. He was real, and what he had done was real. And for a moment the Cold War fell away, and something older and more fundamental took its place. The sheer astonishment of a species that had just, for the first time, left its home planet. 23 days after Gagarin's flight, on May 5, 1961, the United States put its first astronaut in space, Alan Shepard, in a 15-minute suborbital flight that was modest by comparison, but was nonetheless watched by millions of Americans on live television with a collective held breath that ended in an explosion of relief and pride. Shepard was not in orbit. His flight was less than 15 minutes, but he had been to space, and he had come back, and America had done it on live television while the Soviet missions had all been secret until after their success. And then, 20 days after Shepard's flight, President John F. Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress and made an announcement that set the terms of the space race for the rest of the decade. He said that the United States should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade was out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. It was an extraordinary statement, made with a confidence that was not entirely supported by the technical realities of May 1961. The United States had put one man in space for 15 minutes. The moon was 240,000 miles away. The technology required to get there, the rockets, the spacecraft, the navigation systems, the life support, the lunar landing vehicles, did not yet exist. The total amount of time American astronauts had spent in space at the moment Kennedy made his speech was 15 minutes, and he was promising the moon, literally, by 1970. But there was a quality to Kennedy's challenge that went beyond politics or strategy. It was a statement about what human beings could choose to attempt, and what the choosing of impossible things says about who we are. It committed an entire generation of engineers and scientists and astronauts to a project that would consume their professional lives, and it gave the space race a destination, a deadline, and a drama that captured the imagination of the world. The years that followed were years of extraordinary work, extraordinary risk, and devastating loss. The Mercury program gave way to Gemini, which developed the techniques of rendezvous and spacewalking and long-duration flight that the lunar missions would require. Astronauts walked in space for the first time. Spacecraft docked with each other in orbit. Each mission pushed the boundaries of what was known and tested the boundaries of what was survivable. The Soviets, meanwhile, continued to accumulate firsts. The first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, in June of 1963, who orbited the Earth 48 times over 3 days and whose flight would not be matched by another woman for nearly 20 years. The first spacewalk, Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov in March of 1965, who floated outside his capsule for 12 minutes and nearly died when his spacesuit inflated in the vacuum and he could not get back through the airlock, having to partially deflate the suit at the risk of decompression sickness in order to squeeze back inside. And then, on January 27, 1967, the American program suffered its first catastrophic loss. During a launch pad test of the Apollo 1 capsule, a fire broke out inside the pure oxygen atmosphere of the spacecraft. The hatch was designed to open inward and took approximately 90 seconds to open under normal conditions. But the fire built pressure inside the capsule that made it impossible to open at all. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee died on the launch pad in a spacecraft that was not moving before the space age had claimed a single life in flight. The investigation that followed found wiring problems, flammable materials, and design decisions that in retrospect seemed obviously dangerous, but had been accepted in the pressure of meeting Kennedy's deadline. The program stopped. The capsule was redesigned, and when it flew again, it flew better. The moon is getting closer, and so is one of the most dangerous moments in human history. A confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union that brought the world closer to nuclear war than it has ever been before or since. The Cuban Missile Crisis is waiting just ahead of us, and to understand it fully, we need to understand the world that the space race was happening inside, a world of secret submarines and nuclear hair triggers, and two men in rooms on opposite sides of the planet, each holding the power to end civilization. There's a word that gets used a lot in histories of the Cold War, and it is worth pausing on it before we go any further, because it is one of those words that can become so familiar it loses its meaning. The word is brinkmanship. It was coined by a journalist writing about the foreign policy of President Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who had described the art of foreign policy as the ability to get to the verge of war without actually getting into war. The ability to go to the brink. Brinkmanship. It sounds almost elegant when you say it that way. A kind of diplomatic high-wire act, a controlled and sophisticated game played by rational actors who understood the rules and trusted each other to stay just barely on the safe side of catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was brinkmanship. It was also 13 days during which the world came closer to nuclear annihilation than it has ever come before or since, and during which the outcome depended not just on the decisions of the two leaders at the center of it, but on the decisions of submarine commanders and military officers and junior officials operating with incomplete information in conditions of extreme stress, any one of whom could have made a choice that ended everything. It was brinkmanship, yes, but it was also something much more frightening than the elegant word suggests. It was a situation that was at several points genuinely out of control, and the fact that it ended without catastrophe owes as much to luck and to the individual decency of people whose names most of us have never heard as it does to the skill of the statesmen we remember. To understand how the world arrived at those 13 days, we need to understand the specific geography and history of Cuba and what it meant to both superpowers. Cuba is an island approximately 90 miles from the southern tip of Florida. Close enough that on a clear day you can almost see it. Close enough that for the United States, it had always felt less like a foreign country and more like a neighbor whose affairs were America's business. The United States had been deeply involved in Cuba since the Spanish-American War of 1898, when Cuba gained independence from Spain under conditions that left American economic and political influence deeply embedded in the island's affairs. American companies owned much of Cuba's most valuable land and industry. American organized crime ran its casinos in Havana. The Cuban government, through much of the first half of the 20th century, was either directly friendly to American interests or directly propped up by American power. This arrangement produced, as such arrangements tend to produce, a great deal of resentment among Cubans who felt that their country's sovereignty was largely theatrical, that the real decisions about Cuba's economy and politics were made in Washington and in American boardrooms rather than in Havana. And it produced, eventually, a revolution. Fidel Castro was a lawyer's son from eastern Cuba who had studied law at the University of Havana and had been radicalized by a combination of Marxist ideology, Cuban nationalism, and a personal ferocity that made him almost incapable of accepting limits on his ambitions. He had launched a guerrilla insurgency against the American-backed Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista in the mid-1950s, fighting from the mountains of the Sierra Maestra with a small band of followers that included an Argentine doctor named Ernesto Guevara, who became famous under his nickname, Che, and had built his movement slowly and patiently into a genuine popular force. On January 1st, 1959, Batista fled Cuba and Castro's forces entered Havana. The Cuban Revolution had succeeded. The Eisenhower administration watched Castro's rise with deepening alarm. Castro had not initially presented himself as a communist. In his early public statements, he was more nationalist than Marxist, and some American officials believed he might be someone they could work with. But Castro's government nationalized American-owned businesses and properties, executed hundreds of Batista supporters, established a single-party state, and began developing a relationship with the Soviet Union that moved from diplomatic to military with a speed that alarmed Washington. By 1960, the CIA was training Cuban exiles for an invasion that would overthrow Castro, and the Eisenhower administration had broken off diplomatic relations with Cuba. The invasion, The Bay of Pigs operation was inherited by the newly inaugurated President John F. Kennedy in January of 1961, and it became, within months of his taking office, one of the most humiliating episodes in American foreign policy history. On April 17, 1961, approximately 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast. The operation had been built on the assumption that the Cuban population would rise up to support the invaders once they landed, and that the United States could deny involvement. Both assumptions were wrong. The Cuban population did not rise up. Kennedy, unwilling to commit American air power that would make the fiction of non-involvement impossible to maintain, withheld the air support the exile brigade needed. Within 3 days, the invasion had been crushed. The captured exiles were imprisoned and eventually ransomed. Kennedy took public responsibility for the failure, which salvaged something of his personal dignity, but the damage to American credibility, particularly in the eyes of Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, was significant. Khrushchev was a complicated figure, a man who had risen through the murderous machinery of Stalin's Communist Party and survived it, who had denounced Stalin's crimes in a secret speech to the Soviet leadership in 1956 that had shaken the communist world, and who possessed a peasant shrewdness and a volatile temperament that made him simultaneously more human and more unpredictable than his predecessor. He had met Kennedy at a summit in Vienna in June of 1961, just 2 months after the Bay of Pigs disaster, and had come away with an impression of the young American president as inexperienced, uncertain, and susceptible to pressure. This assessment was not entirely wrong, and Kennedy knew it, and the knowledge stung him and shaped his determination to respond more forcefully the next time a confrontation arose. The next confrontation arose from a Soviet decision that was, in its own logic, entirely rational, and in its potential consequences, almost incomprehensibly dangerous. By 1962, the United States had nuclear missiles in Turkey, American Jupiter missiles, aimed at the Soviet Union, capable of reaching Moscow in approximately 16 minutes. From a Soviet perspective, this was an intolerable provocation, an American nuclear dagger pressed against the Soviet throat. Khrushchev's response was to press a dagger back, to secretly place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida, capable of reaching Washington in approximately the same 16 minutes. It was not an irrational move by the cold logic of nuclear deterrence. It was an attempt to restore a balance that Khrushchev felt had been dangerously tilted in America's favor. The construction of Soviet missile sites in Cuba began in the summer of 1962, carried out with elaborate precautions of secrecy. Soviet ships carried the missiles and equipment under cover of darkness or disguised as civilian cargo. The construction workers were Soviet military personnel instructed to wear civilian clothing. But secrecy at this scale, involving this much physical infrastructure, is difficult to maintain indefinitely. And on October 14, 1962, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flew over western Cuba, and its cameras captured images of what was unmistakably a Soviet medium-range ballistic missile site under construction near the town of San Cristobal. The photographs were analyzed overnight and brought to Kennedy on the morning of October 16th. He was 45 years old, had been president for less than 2 years, and was now looking at evidence that the Soviet Union was placing nuclear weapons 90 miles from the American coast. He convened a secret advisory group, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, which came to be called the XCOM, and for the next 13 days, while the world went about its ordinary business in complete ignorance of what was happening, this group of men met almost continuously in the White House, debating options and arguing about consequences in one of the most consequential series of conversations in human history. The options on the table range from a diplomatic approach, simply asking the Soviets to remove the missiles, to a full-scale military invasion of Cuba. In between were an airstrike to destroy the missile sites before they became operational, and a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent any further Soviet military shipments. The military advisors, almost unanimously, pushed for the airstrike. The Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended a massive military response. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force chief who had overseen the firebombing of Japanese cities and who regarded nuclear weapons with a strategic matter-of-factness that terrified the civilians around him, told Kennedy that a blockade was essentially appeasement and that the United States should bomb the missile sites immediately. Kennedy pushed back. He had read, just months earlier, a book called The Guns of August, Barbara Tuchman's account of how the First World War had begun, how the leaders of Europe in 1914 had stumbled into a catastrophe that none of them had wanted, carried forward by the momentum of military plans and alliance obligations and miscalculations until the point of no return had passed before anyone fully realized it. Kennedy was determined not to be one of those leaders. He wanted options, and he wanted time, and he was deeply skeptical of military advice that presented aggressive action as obviously correct without adequately weighing what happened next. He chose the blockade, reframed as a quarantine for legal reasons, since a blockade is technically an act of war under international law. On the evening of October 22, 1962, Kennedy addressed the American people on live television, revealing the existence of the missiles in Cuba and announcing the quarantine. The speech was calm, measured, and deeply alarming. Americans went to sleep that night knowing that their country was in a confrontation with the Soviet Union over nuclear weapons, and that no one could say with confidence how it would end. Soviet ships were already at sea, heading for Cuba, carrying more military equipment. The question of whether they would stop at the quarantine line or attempt to run it was, for several days, the question that the fate of the world appeared to hang upon. If a Soviet ship attempted to run the blockade and was stopped by force, Soviet military doctrine called for a response. What that response would be, and what it would trigger, ran down a chain of escalation that ended in a place no one wanted to look at directly. On October 24th, the Soviet ships approaching the quarantine line slowed, stopped, and turned around. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, watching the intelligence reports in the State Department, said quietly to his colleague McGeorge Bundy that they were eyeball to eyeball, and he thought the other fellow had just blinked. The immediate crisis of the Soviet ships had passed, but the missiles already in Cuba were still there, and the sites were still being worked on around the clock, and the most dangerous moment of the entire crisis was still ahead. Beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, a Soviet submarine designated B-59 had been out of contact with Moscow for days. It was armed with a nuclear torpedo, a weapon with a warhead roughly equivalent to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The submarine was being harassed by American destroyers dropping small depth charges, signaling charges, intended to force the submarine to surface and identify itself, not intended as an attack. But inside the submarine, the crew did not know this. They had not received communications from Moscow. They did not know whether war had already begun. The air inside the submarine was deteriorating. The temperature had risen to over 100 degrees, and the captain, Valentin Savitsky, had reached the end of what he could endure. He gave the order to arm the nuclear torpedo. He intended to fire it. On Soviet submarines of that era, the protocol for launching nuclear weapons required the agreement of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the executive officer. The captain and the political officer both agreed. The executive officer, a man named Vasily Arkhipov, refused. He argued with the captain in the suffocating heat of the submarine for long enough that the moment passed. The order was rescinded, and the submarine surfaced without firing. Vasily Arkhipov is not a famous name. He has no monument in most countries, no holiday named after him, no place in the popular mythology of the Cold War. But there is a serious argument to be made that he is the man who saved the world. On an October afternoon in 1962, in a metal tube beneath the Atlantic Ocean, by simply saying no. The diplomatic resolution came through a combination of public and private channels. Publicly, Khrushchev offered to remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States pledged not to invade Cuba. Privately, through a back channel involving Kennedy's brother Robert Kennedy and the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, an additional deal was struck. The United States would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but only quietly, after a decent interval, so that it would not appear to be a concession made under pressure. Kennedy accepted. Khrushchev accepted. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet missiles would be withdrawn from Cuba. The crisis was over. The aftermath was instructive. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev had been shaken by how close things had come. Shaken in a way that neither fully communicated to their publics at the time, but which shaped their subsequent behavior in profound ways. A direct telephone hotline, the famous red phone, though it was actually a teletype machine and later a fax machine, not a telephone, was established between Washington and Moscow so that the two leaders could communicate directly in any future crisis without the delays and misunderstandings that had complicated communication during the 13 days. The hotline was a small thing, a wire and a machine, but it represented something important, an acknowledgement that the two superpowers shared, beneath all their ideology and rivalry, a common interest in not accidentally destroying the world. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963, 14 months after the missile crisis ended. Khrushchev was removed from power by his own colleagues in October of 1964, partly because they felt he had mishandled the Cuban affair and backed down too visibly. The two men who had stood at the brink together and chosen, ultimately, to step back, were both gone from power within 2 years of the crisis. But the world they left behind was changed. The near miss of October 1962 accelerated negotiations on nuclear arms control that produced the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, ending atmospheric nuclear testing. It began a long, slow, deeply imperfect process of managing the nuclear competition rather than simply racing it to wherever it led. It did not end the Cold War. That would take another 3 decades, and its ending would come not with a bang, but with the quiet collapse of a system that had exhausted itself from within. But it marked a turning point of sorts, the moment when both sides had looked into the abyss and found that the abyss looked back and decided, quietly, to take a small step away from the edge. And in the meantime, the rockets kept flying upward. The space race continued, and the goal that Kennedy had set, a man on the moon before the decade was out, was still out there, waiting 240,000 miles above the world that had come so close to destroying itself. There is a photograph that was taken on December 24th, 1968, by an astronaut named William Anders, who was orbiting the moon aboard Apollo 8. It shows the Earth rising above the lunar horizon, a small, luminous sphere of blue and white hanging in the absolute blackness of space. Impossibly beautiful, impossibly fragile, the only color in a universe of darkness. Anders later said that they had gone to explore the moon, and what they had discovered was the Earth. The photograph became one of the most reproduced images in human history. And it did something that no political speech or philosophical argument had quite managed to do. It showed human beings what they looked like from the outside, from a distance, from space. One world, one pale blue sphere, everything that had ever happened to any human being who had ever lived, contained in that small circle of light. It is a good place to end this story, and also a good place to begin thinking about what the story means. But we are not quite there yet. To get to that photograph, and to the extraordinary morning 7 months later, when 2 human beings stepped on the surface of the moon, we have to travel through the final years of the space race. Years of grief and triumph, and technical achievement so audacious that even now, with the perspective of more than half a century, it is difficult to fully believe that it happened. After the Apollo 1 fire in January of 1967, NASA spent 20 months redesigning the Apollo spacecraft. The pure oxygen atmosphere that had fed the fire was replaced with a mixed oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere on the launch pad. The flammable materials inside the capsule were replaced. The hatch was redesigned to open outward in seconds rather than inward in minutes. Hundreds of individual changes were made, each one representing a lesson learned from the deaths of Grissom, White, and Chaffee, men whose deaths, in the grim calculus of technological development, may have made the eventual success of Apollo possible by forcing a thoroughness of redesign that might not have happened otherwise. This does not make their loss less terrible. It makes it more poignant, the way that the most painful things sometimes do. The Soviets, meanwhile, were suffering their own catastrophic losses. Their lunar program, which Western intelligence agencies had long suspected existed, but which Soviet authorities publicly denied, was in serious trouble. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer whose genius had driven the Soviet space program from Sputnik through Gagarin, had died on the operating table in January 1966 during what should have been routine surgery, a death that left the Soviet program without its irreplaceable center of gravity at the moment it needed him most. His successor could not command the same authority or inspire the same loyalty, and the Soviet lunar program fractured into competing factions and rival designs. In April of 1967, just 3 months after Apollo 1, the Soviets lost their own cosmonaut. Vladimir Komarov flew the new Soyuz spacecraft on its maiden voyage, a mission that was plagued with technical problems from the moment it reached orbit. The parachute system failed on re-entry, and Komarov's capsule slammed into the ground at high speed. Komarov knew he was going to die. The Soviet tracking stations recorded his final transmissions, a man in a failing spacecraft, angry and frightened, knowing what was coming. He became the first human being to die in spaceflight, and his death, like the Apollo 1 fire, forced a period of painful reassessment. But the Americans were moving again, and moving with a focus and a pace that the Soviet program, fractured and demoralized, could not match. Apollo 7 flew in October of 1968, the first crewed Apollo mission, an 11-day Earth orbit test of the command and service module that went almost perfectly. And then, in December of that year, came Apollo 8, a mission that represented one of the most audacious decisions in the history of space exploration. The original plan for Apollo 8 had been an Earth orbit test of the lunar module. But the lunar module was not ready, and NASA, aware that Soviet lunar missions were continuing and terrified of losing the race at the final moment, made a decision that would have seemed reckless to anyone outside the program, and seemed only barely acceptable to many people within it: to send Apollo 8 to orbit the moon without a lunar module, with no way to land and no lifeboat if something went wrong with the command module. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders launched on December 21st, 1968, and 3 days later became the first human beings to leave Earth orbit, the first to travel to another world, the first to see the far side of the moon with their own eyes, and the first to see the Earth from truly deep space. On Christmas Eve, they read from the book of Genesis in a broadcast that reached an estimated 1 billion people, the largest television audience in history to that point. And Anders took his photograph of the Earth rising above the moon, and the image traveled back across 240,000 miles of space and into the homes and the hearts of species that was, in that moment, seeing itself clearly for the first time. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 flew the entire stack to the moon and descended to within 47,000 feet of the lunar surface. A full dress rehearsal that stopped just short of landing, the lunar module's engines burning to bring it back up to orbit rather than down to the surface. The crew of Apollo 10 reportedly used rather more colorful language than the Christmas Eve broadcast of Apollo 8, particularly during a moment when the lunar module briefly went into an unexpected spinning maneuver that was traced afterward to an incorrectly set switch. They survived it, and everything was ready. July 16th, 1969. Launch Day. The Saturn V rocket that stood on the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center was 363 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty, and when its 5F-1 engines ignited, they produced more thrust than has ever been generated by any rocket before or since. The noise and the shockwave were felt miles away. 38 seconds after launch, the Saturn V passed through the speed of sound. 12 minutes after launch, Apollo 11 was in Earth orbit. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins spent 2.5 hours in Earth orbit checking their systems before the translunar injection burn that sent them toward the moon. The journey took 3 days. On July 19th, they entered lunar orbit, and on July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin transferred into the lunar module, named Eagle, and began their descent while Collins remained in lunar orbit in the command module, alone in a way that very few human beings have ever been alone, 240,000 miles from Earth with 2 colleagues on another world and no way to help them if something went wrong. The descent did not go entirely smoothly, and the moments of difficulty during it deserve to be remembered because they illustrate something important about what the achievement actually was. Not a smooth, frictionless triumph of technology, but a human accomplishment built on improvisation and nerve as much as engineering. At around 6,000 feet altitude, the landing computer began displaying a series of alarm codes, 1202, then 1201, that neither Armstrong nor Aldrin had ever seen in training. In the mission control room in Houston, a 26-year-old guidance officer named Steve Bales had about 3 seconds to determine whether the alarm indicated a fatal system failure that required an abort or whether the mission could continue. The alarms were indicating that the computer was being overloaded with data and was resetting itself to handle the most critical tasks. Not a fatal failure, but a serious warning. Bales, drawing on a briefing he had received weeks earlier about this exact type of alarm, called go. The mission continued. Then, with the surface coming up fast, Armstrong looked out the window and realized that the computer was guiding Eagle toward a crater the size of a football field, rimmed with boulders the size of cars. Landing there would almost certainly destroy the spacecraft. He took manual control, flying Eagle horizontally across the lunar surface while the fuel gauge counted down toward the abort threshold. Mission Control listened to the data and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Armstrong was the pilot and the landscape was in front of him, not in Houston. With approximately 30 seconds of fuel remaining, Armstrong found a flat spot and set Eagle down. The contact light illuminated. The engine shut off. Dust that had not been disturbed in billions of years settled back onto the surface. And Armstrong said the words that went around the world and have echoed ever since. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. In mission control, men who had spent years working toward this moment wept and pounded each other on the back, and then rapidly collected themselves because there was still work to do. Armstrong and Aldrin were supposed to sleep before the moonwalk, but neither of them could, and Mission Control agreed to move the schedule forward. At 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong descended the ladder of the lunar module, paused on the bottom rung, and stepped onto the surface of the moon. He said that it was one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, intending to say one small step for a man, but the article was lost either in transmission or in the moment, and what the world heard was what it heard. He was followed by Aldrin, who looked around at the landscape and described it as magnificent desolation. Two words that have always seemed to me to capture something true, not just about the moon, but about the whole extraordinary, terrible, beautiful story we've been telling in these hours together. Magnificent desolation. The capacity of the human species for destruction and for creation, for cruelty and for courage, for building systems of murder and building rockets that reach the moon, held in two words by a man standing on another world. They planted a flag. American, because Americans had built the rocket, though the plaque they left on the lunar surface said we came in peace for all mankind, and meant it. They collected samples. They deployed instruments. They spoke by telephone to President Nixon, who told them it was the most historic phone call ever made from the White House, which was probably true. They spent 2 hours and 31 minutes on the surface, and then they climbed back into Eagle, and the ascent engine fired. A single engine with no backup because there was no room for a backup, and it worked, and they rose from the surface of the moon, and Collins saw them coming and maneuvered the command module to meet them, and the three of them came home. They splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th, 1969, 5 months and 4 days before Kennedy's end-of-decade deadline. Kennedy himself had been dead for 6 years, but the goal he had set, the impossible thing he had promised, had been done. 6 further Apollo missions would go to the moon, 5 of them successfully landing, one of them, Apollo 13, surviving a catastrophic oxygen tank explosion through an improvisation so extraordinary it became a story told for its own sake, separate from the larger mission of which it was a part. The last human beings to walk on the moon were Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt of Apollo 17, who left the surface in December of 1972. Cernan was the last to climb the ladder, and he paused before he did and made a quiet promise that humanity would return. We have not yet kept that promise, though we are, at this writing, beginning to try again. And so we come to the end of the story we set out to tell, or rather, to this resting place in it, because the story does not end. It never ends. The causes of the Second World War grew from the unresolved wounds of the First, and the Cold War grew from the rubble of the Second, and the space race grew from the missiles of the Cold War, and the world we live in today grew from all of it, from the Treaty of Versailles and the Nuremberg laws and the beaches of Normandy and the skies above Hiroshima and the launch pad at Baikonur and the Sea of Tranquility. What is the lesson of all of this? I'm not sure there is one lesson, clean and portable and useful. History does not work that way. But there are things that the story seems to insist upon, things that come through regardless of which angle you approach it from. One is the consequence of cruelty. The dehumanization of the Jews of Europe did not begin with the gas chambers. It began with a clause in a treaty and a newspaper editorial and a boycott of a shop and a law about citizenship and a night of broken glass. It was built in steps, each one making the next one possible. And at every step there were people who could have said no, not just in Germany but across Europe and across the world, and mostly did not. The Holocaust is the most extreme example in modern history of what happens when cruelty is permitted to become policy and policy is permitted to become machinery. But it is not a unique kind of thing. It is an extreme version of something that the human species is capable of and has demonstrated itself capable of in many places and many times. That is not a comfortable thought. It is a necessary one. Another thing the story insists upon is the consequence of courage. The Norwegian resistance fighters who destroyed the heavy water plant, the soldiers who went up the bluffs at Omaha Beach, the RAF pilots who flew into the Luftwaffe over England, Vasily Arkhipov, who said no in a submarine, Steve Bales, who said go on mission control, the people who hid their neighbors, the people who told the truth when lying was safer, the people who refused, in the specific moment that history handed them, to do the thing that was expected and easy and wrong. History is not only made by the people whose names are on monuments. It is made, often decisively, by people doing the right thing in a moment when no one is watching and the outcome is not yet known. And perhaps the last thing the story insists upon is that photograph. Earthrise, the small blue sphere in the darkness. All of it. All of the suffering and the courage and the cruelty and the brilliance and the love and the loss. All of it contained on one small world, which from a sufficient distance looks very beautiful and very alone. We went to the moon to win a race, and what we brought back was a picture of home. It seems like the kind of thing that should change how we treat each other. It seems like the kind of image that should make the old hatreds look small and the old divisions look absurd. And perhaps it does, for some people, some of the time. Perhaps that is enough to be going on with. This concludes our journey through the history of World War II, Nazi Germany, and through the space race. If you're interested in resources to help you relax better or fall asleep naturally, be sure to check out the description below. Don't forget to like this video, and be sure and subscribe and turn on notifications so you know when the next journey through history is ready to embark on. Thanks again, and have a good night.